Keir Starmer faces unprecedented public backlash as nationwide protests intensify. Britain is witnessing an extraordinary wave of civil unrest as thousands of ordinary citizens take to the streets, voicing their frustration over Keir Starmer's controversial policies. From struggling pensioners unable to afford heating to young families burdened by broken promises, the British public's patience has worn thin. Disillusionment is spreading, and Starmer knows all too well that this crisis could very well cost him his position as Prime Minister. Did you know that over 95% of our viewers aren't subscribed to the channel? We totally get it, life gets busy, and sometimes it's easy to forget. But here's the thing, subscribing is completely free, and it really helps us keep creating the content you enjoy. So, why not hit that subscribe button and join our community? It only takes a second, but it makes a world of difference to us. Thank you for your support. Shocking footage emerging from across the country captures scenes that were once unthinkable in Britain. Elderly protesters, many well into their 70s and 80s, wrapped in thick coats, braving the freezing temperatures as they hold handmade placards outside government buildings. These are not radical activists or professional demonstrators. These are lifelong Labour supporters, individuals who dedicated their votes to a party they believed would protect them in their later years. Yet now, they feel utterly betrayed by the very men who once promised to stand by them. A betrayal of the most vulnerable. During his campaign, Starmer assured voters that he would safeguard society's most vulnerable. With a hand on his heart, he pledged, "We will protect winter fuel payments for pensioners." It was not just a passing statement, it was a central promise, a declaration of intent that helped secure his electoral victory. But in one of the swiftest U-turns in modern British political history, Starmer's government announced sweeping cuts to winter fuel payments, leaving over 10 million elderly Britons facing the prospect of a bitterly cold winter without adequate financial support. Many now find themselves forced into an impossible dilemma: should they heat their homes or put food on the table? In Manchester, I spoke to an elderly woman at a protest, her face etched with anger and despair. Clutching her coat tightly, her hands trembling from both the cold and emotion, she told me, "I've worked my entire life, paid my taxes, and trusted my government to support me in old age. Now, I can't even afford to keep my house warm. It's humiliating." Across the country, from Durham to Birmingham, from Newcastle to Liverpool, Labour's most loyal voters are turning against the party in an unprecedented show of defiance. Pensioner action groups are springing up overnight, using community centres and social media to organise demonstrations and mobilise support. Their message is clear: Keir Starmer has failed them, and they will not be ignored. The human cost of policy failures. Projections now indicate that 8.4 million Britons will face fuel poverty this winter, a figure that is as alarming as it is avoidable. But for many elderly individuals, this is not merely about discomfort, it is a matter of life and death. Hypothermia-related deaths among the elderly spike dramatically during cold winters, and with energy prices at an all-time high, the consequences of these cuts could be catastrophic. The government's response has been feeble at best. Officials have attempted to downplay the crisis, arguing that financial constraints necessitated these cuts. But such justifications hold little weight for those on the receiving end of these policies. Many pensioners are now questioning whether their decades of contributions to the economy mean anything at all. What is particularly striking about this crisis is the sheer scale of the backlash. Unlike previous protests that were often confined to isolated pockets of dissatisfaction, this movement has gained traction across all corners of society. And it is not just pensioners who feel betrayed. Students, young professionals, and even some Labour MPs are voicing their discontent. A government in crisis. Starmer's leadership is now under immense scrutiny. His failure to uphold his commitment to pensioners is just one of many controversies threatening to unravel his premiership. One of his most significant campaign promises was to abolish university tuition fees, a pledge that resonated strongly with young voters and helped Labour secure a substantial share of the youth vote. Yet, last week, his government confirmed that tuition fees would not only remain in place but could even increase. The backlash was immediate. At Manchester University, what began as a small gathering of frustrated students escalated into a full-scale walkout, leaving lecture halls eerily empty. Protesters carried banners reading, "We voted for change, not chains." Similar demonstrations erupted at Bristol and Edinburgh, where thousands of students abandoned their classes to take to the streets. Perhaps the most unexpected development has been the formation of an alliance between student activists and pensioner groups. In Manchester, elderly protesters leaning on walking sticks marched alongside students carrying laptops and textbooks. Despite the vast generational gap, they are united by a common grievance: they feel deceived by Keir Starmer. The economic fallout. Meanwhile, Britain's economic landscape is in freefall. The London Stock Exchange is experiencing its worst performance in 14 years, rattled by uncertainty and dwindling investor confidence. Rising living costs, stagnant wages, and a wave of business closures have left millions struggling to keep up with mortgage payments, rent, and daily expenses. Public anger is no longer just directed at specific policies, it is a growing indictment of Starmer's overall governance. Critics argue that he has demonstrated a lack of conviction, an inability to uphold his own pledges, and a willingness to prioritize political expediency over principled leadership. Even within his own party, dissent is beginning to spread. Some Labour MPs, concerned about the party's dwindling credibility, are quietly expressing their dissatisfaction behind closed doors. Others fear that unless drastic action is taken to regain public trust, Labour could suffer heavy losses in the next general election. A nation on the brink. Even the police, traditionally neutral in political matters, have begun to show signs of resistance. In Bristol, officers were seen removing their helmets in solidarity with peaceful protesters, a rare and powerful act that has quickly gained momentum across the country. With each passing day, the movement grows stronger, fueled by a sense of injustice and disillusionment. The protests, which began as a reaction to the winter fuel payment cuts, have now evolved into a broader rebellion against a government perceived to be failing its people. The question now is not whether Starmer's leadership will survive this crisis, but for how much longer he can hold on. His grip on power is slipping, and unless he takes decisive action to address the growing dissent, his tenure as Prime Minister may be remembered not for what he achieved, but for how spectacularly it unraveled. Government in disarray as nationwide protests escalate. The British government is struggling to respond as the sheer scale of the protests makes it impossible to dismiss them as isolated incidents. What began as a reaction to a single policy has transformed into a nationwide movement, sending shockwaves through Westminster. Keir Starmer's leadership is crumbling under the relentless pressure, with both his authority and credibility eroding by the day. Recent footage capturing Starmer literally fleeing from a crowd of angry protesters has gone viral, quickly becoming the defining image of his leadership crisis. The clip, which has been widely shared across social media, has come to symbolize his inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to confront the very people he was elected to serve. The sight of a prime minister running from his own citizens has only fueled public outrage, reinforcing the perception that his government is detached, out of touch, and incapable of addressing the deepening crisis. Westminster in turmoil, cabinet divisions and calls for resignation. Behind closed doors, Starmer's government is in disarray. Ministers are divided, with some privately questioning his judgment while others fear that the damage is now beyond repair. Senior advisors are scrambling for solutions, but with protests gaining momentum across the country, it is becoming increasingly clear that no amount of political spin or damage control will be enough to restore public trust. Even within the Labour Party, murmurs of dissent are growing louder. Some MPs, alarmed by the scale of public discontent, are reportedly considering breaking ranks. Leaked reports suggest that backbenchers have begun discussing the possibility of a leadership challenge should Starmer fail to regain control. Westminster insiders are already whispering about the possibility of his resignation before Christmas, with some sources suggesting that senior party figures are quietly exploring alternative leadership options. A movement that cannot be ignored. What is unfolding is no longer a fleeting moment of public anger, it is a full-scale political reckoning. The people of Britain have found their voice, and the balance of power is shifting. This is an uprising of ordinary citizens from all walks of life, pensioners, students, workers, and even police officers, standing together, united by a shared sense of betrayal and a determination to hold their leaders accountable. The resilience of this movement is remarkable. In major cities and rural towns alike, protests continue to grow in size and intensity. Pensioners, who once placed unwavering faith in the Labour Party, are now standing shoulder to shoulder with disillusioned students who feel equally deceived. Trade unions, community organizations, and grassroots activists are mobilizing at an unprecedented scale, ensuring that this movement does not fade but rather strengthens with each passing day. Even elements of law enforcement appear to be aligning with the demonstrators. In an unprecedented act of solidarity, police officers in several cities have been seen removing their helmets in support of peaceful protesters. This powerful gesture has only added to the government's difficulties, as it becomes increasingly clear that this is not merely a political crisis, it is a crisis of legitimacy. A government on the brink of collapse. Keir Starmer's administration, once hailed as a beacon of hope, now teeters on the brink of collapse, unable to contain the growing wave of public dissent. The Prime Minister's attempts to downplay the crisis have failed spectacularly. Every day that passes without a meaningful response further cements the perception that his government is paralyzed, out of ideas, and fundamentally disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people. What began as a protest against winter fuel payment cuts has ignited a much broader conversation about broken promises, failed leadership, and the erosion of public trust. If Starmer is willing to abandon pensioners, if he is willing to betray students, if he is willing to turn his back on the very people who placed him in power, what else is he willing to sacrifice? A defining moment in British politics. The British people have awakened. This is no longer just a protest, it is a demand for real change. It is a powerful reminder that democracy is not a privilege granted by politicians but a right exercised by the people. As winter deepens and protests intensify, one thing is abundantly clear: this is not just a passing wave of outrage. This is a historic moment, one that will leave an indelible mark on Britain's political landscape. Whether Starmer can survive this crisis remains uncertain, but what is undeniable is that the status quo has been shattered. The old rules no longer apply. The people have made their voices heard, and they will not be ignored. The question now is, will you stand with the people?